In the early hours of a cool autumn morning in 1994, the airspace south of Sydney was quiet but never empty. Cargo flights moved invisibly along established corridors. Long-haul arrivals from across the Pacific descended in measured steps toward the coastline. On radar screens inside approach control, luminous symbols drifted slowly across a dark field, each tagged with altitude, speed, and call sign. Precise, orderly, controlled. Beyond the glow of the city, the land rose unexpectedly. South of the metropolitan basin, ridgelines and elevated terrain formed a dark perimeter. By day they were plainly visible, etched against the horizon. At night they became something else entirely, indistinguishable from cloud, ocean, or sky. Only charts, instruments, and disciplined procedure separated a safe descent from unseen ground. Australian National Airways Flight 732, a routine domestic service, was approaching from the south after a normal sector. Nothing in its flight plan suggested difficulty. The aircraft had departed on time. En route communications had been uneventful. Fuel reserves were adequate. No technical anomalies had been reported. Inside the cockpit, the descent phase had begun. Power was reduced gradually. The aircraft eased downward through laid cloud, its engine settling into a lower, steady tone. Instrument panels cast a subdued amber glow across the flight deck. Outside the windscreen there was no horizon, only a diffuse gray-black void occasionally punctuated by the faint shimmer of distant coastal lights far ahead. Approach procedures into Sydney required careful altitude management. Terrain clearance margins tightened as aircraft converged toward the basin from the south. Minimum safe altitudes were not suggestions. They were barriers built from past accidents, lines drawn on charts in response to loss. Flight 732 continued downward. Air traffic control issued routine instructions, spacing arrivals with practice cadence. Voices on the frequency were calm, clipped, professional. Each transmission acknowledged, read back, confirmed. Nothing in the exchanges conveyed urgency. To controllers monitoring the sector, the aircraft was one of several descending toward the airport in orderly sequence. At cruising altitude, commercial flight often feels detached from the physical world below. During descent, that separation disappears. Air becomes denser. Turbulence returns. Terrain begins to matter again, even when it cannot be seen. The aircraft cross the coastline. Over water, night flying can produce a deceptive sense of altitude. Without ground references, crews rely entirely on instruments. A slight deviation, a premature descent, a misinterpreted clearance, an incorrect setting, can remain invisible until the margin is gone. Cloud layers thickened. On radar, Flight 732's altitude readout continued to decrease steadily, consistent with an approach profile. Nothing about its track immediately suggested danger. Yet the terrain beneath the aircraft was no longer flat coastal plain. It rose in irregular steps toward the high ground south of the city. Inside the cockpit, workload increased. Checklists were completed. Approach briefings reviewed. Navigation aids tuned and cross-checked. Descent calculations refined. Each action was routine, procedural, expected. The choreography of modern aviation designed to eliminate ambiguity. But procedures depend on accurate assumptions. When one assumption is wrong, the entire sequence can begin to drift. The aircraft descended below a layer of cloud into darker air. There were still no visual references. Ground proximity warnings, if triggered, would offer only seconds of reaction time at approach speeds. In 1994, terrain awareness technology was not yet as advanced or widespread as it would become in later decades. Crews relied heavily on charts, altimeters, radio navigation, and strict adherence to published procedures. Flight 732 continued toward Sydney, its landing lights still off, its path intersecting a region where terrain rose faster than the descent profile allowed. In the city, most residents were asleep. Along the southern outskirts, a few scattered lights marked isolated homes and industrial sites. Above them, unseen in the cloud-dark sky, a passenger aircraft carrying dozens of people was closing the final distance to the ground at more than 4 nautical miles per minute. On the approach controller's display, the data block flickered slightly as the radar sweep refreshed. Altitude, speed, call sign, all appeared consistent. Then, without warning, the return changed. Not dramatically at first, a momentary irregularity, the kind that could be attributed to radar shadowing or signal attenuation near terrain. Controllers watched carefully, verifying that the transponder information remained valid. Calls were made, instructions issued, standard procedures followed, but the aircraft did not respond as expected. What had been a routine arrival was becoming something else, not yet understood, not yet visible, but irreversible. Minutes earlier, nothing had seemed unusual. Now, controllers began to scan adjacent frequencies, attempting contact. Other aircraft in the vicinity were asked to monitor. Radar data continued to update, but the pattern no longer matched a stable approach. South of Sydney, beyond the reach of city lights, the ridgelines remained hidden beneath cloud and darkness. By the time the first emergency calls were initiated, the accident had already occurred. Rescue units would later describe the site as difficult to reach, isolated, and steep, terrain that offered no visual warning to an aircraft descending through cloud at night. Investigators would spend months reconstructing the final minutes, assembling fragments of data, procedures, and human decisions into a coherent chain of events. But in that moment, in the quiet early hours when Flight 732 was expected to land routinely, the loss was sudden, absolute, and unseen by the world below. The radar screen returned to its steady rhythm, other aircraft continuing their approaches as dawn slowly approached the horizon. A normal night of operations had absorbed an abnormal event, and for those who would later study the accident, the question was not what happened at the moment of impact, but how a sequence of ordinary decisions allowed a controlled aircraft to descend into terrain that should have been safely avoided. The answers would reshape procedures, training, and technology, but only after the silence of that morning had settled across the hills south of Sydney. In 1994, Australia's domestic aviation system was in the midst of transition. Deregulation early in the decade had reshaped competition, forcing airlines to adapt quickly to new economic realities. Routes that had once been predictable became contested. Scheduling intensified. Aircraft utilization increased. Efficiency, once balanced with caution, became a measurable performance target. Within this environment operated Australian National Airways, a carrier with a long institutional memory and a reputation built over decades of domestic service. The airline had weathered previous shifts in Australia's aviation landscape, from wartime operations to the regulated duopoly era, but the 1990s demanded something different. Modernization programs were underway, fleets were being updated incrementally, and operational procedures were being revised to match contemporary standards. Yet aviation evolves unevenly. New aircraft often coexist with older systems. Updated procedures intersect with habits formed over thousands of prior flights. Safety improvements introduced in one area may lag in another. The result is not unsafe by design, but complex, dependent on precise coordination across technology, training, and human judgment. Flight 732 operated within that complexity. The route into Sydney was among the busiest in the country. Kingsford Smith Airport, positioned on the edge of Botany Bay, required aircraft to transition from open ocean airspace into a densely structured arrival system compressed between terrain, urban development, and heavy traffic. Approaches from the south were particularly sensitive. Aircraft descending from cruising altitude had to navigate a corridor that narrowed as it approached the basin, with rising ground to the west and southwest. By day, the geography was unmistakable. By night, especially under cloud, it became abstract, a terrain profile represented only by contour lines on approach charts and minimum safe altitude figures printed in small type. These numbers were the product of detailed surveys and past lessons learned at great cost. They defined invisible floors beneath which descent should never occur until specific navigation fixes were positively identified. Weather added another layer. Autumn conditions along the New South Wales coast often produced stratified cloud decks, intermittent rain bands, and variable winds. Moist maritime air meeting cooler inland temperatures could generate low ceilings that obscured terrain, while leaving higher altitudes deceptively smooth. Pilots descending through such layers might encounter clear air above, turbulence within, and featureless darkness below, a sequence capable of disrupting spatial awareness if not carefully managed. On the night of the accident, meteorological reports indicated marginal visual conditions in the approach region. Visibility fluctuated. Cloud bases varied across the sector. While still within operational limits, the environment demanded strict reliance on instrument procedures. The aircraft assigned to Flight 732 reflected another transitional reality of the era. It was neither obsolete nor state-of-the-art, a generation of airliner design before the widespread integration of advanced terrain awareness systems that would later become standard. Its avionics suite included reliable navigation radios, autopilot capability, and conventional ground proximity warning technology. What it did not possess was a predictive terrain database capable of displaying rising ground ahead of the aircraft's path. Such systems were still emerging in the early 1990s. Safety philosophy at the time emphasized procedural compliance. Crews were trained to follow published approach profiles meticulously, cross-check altitudes at defined points, and verify position using multiple navigation sources. The assumption was that disciplined adherence would compensate for technological limitations. Most of the time, it did. The crew assigned to the flight were experienced professionals, product of a training system shaped by both traditional airmanship and modern crew resource management principles. CLM, introduced mildly during the 1980s, encouraged open communication, mutual monitoring, and the reduction of hierarchical barriers in the cockpit. By 1994, it had become embedded in airline training programs, though its practical application varied depending on crew pairing, workload, and situational stress. Fatigue management was another evolving area. Duty time regulations existed, but scientific understanding of circadian disruption in aviation was still developing. Early morning operations, departures or arrivals scheduled during the biological low point of human alertness, were recognized as higher risk but remained common due to scheduling demands. Flight 732's arrival window placed it within that vulnerable period. Air traffic control procedures around Sydney were designed to maintain safe separation while accommodating high traffic volume. Controllers relied on radar vectors, altitude assignments, and standardized arrival routes to sequence aircraft efficiently. Communication clarity was essential. A misunderstood clearance could propagate quickly into a positional error. In most circumstances, laid safeguard prevented a single mistake from escalating. Minimum sector altitude protected against terrain. Approach procedures defined step-down points. Controllers monitored deviations. Crews cross-checked instruments. Redundancy was built into the system, but redundancy assumes that each layer functions independently. If multiple defenses weaken simultaneously, if weather obscures visual cues, if workload increases, if expectations diverge from reality, if technology lacks predictive capability, the margin can erode quietly without any single alarm indicating imminent danger. Investigators would later examine not only the flight itself, but the operational context surrounding it, training records, procedural manuals, regulatory oversight, and the broader industry environment of the early 1990s. Accidents rarely originate in isolation. They emerge from ecosystems. In the months before the crash, no extraordinary warnings had been issued regarding approaches into Sydney from the south. The procedures in place were considered adequate. Airlines operated them daily without incident. Crews trusted the system because it had consistently delivered safe outcomes. That trust, while justified, carried an inherent risk. Familiarity can reduce vigilance. Routine flights encourage routine expectations. When conditions deviate subtly rather than dramatically, recognition may lag behind reality. A descent that begins slightly early may still feel correct. An altitude that appears reasonable on one instrument may not immediately be challenged if other tasks demand attention. Flight 732 entered the Sydney approach system as one more routine arrival, predictable, manageable, unremarkable. Nothing in its dispatch documentation suggested it would not complete the flight normally. Maintenance logs showed no unresolved critical defects. Weather forecasts, though marginal, remained within operating minima. Crew qualifications met all regulatory requirements. Air traffic control staffing was standard for the hour. The stage was set not for catastrophe, but for ordinary operations. And it is precisely in ordinary operations that aviation accidents most often take root. By the time the aircraft began its descent toward the coastal basin, the contextual elements were already in place. A demanding approach environment, limited visual conditions, technology representative of its era, human operators navigating workload and expectation, and a system optimized for efficiency as much as safety. Individually, none of these factors were extraordinary. Together, they formed the backdrop against which the accident would unfold, a convergence invisible to those participating in it, but starkly clear in hindsight. The story of Flight 732 cannot be understood through a single lens. To reconstruct the accident accurately, one must examine four interconnected perspectives: the aircraft, the crew, the environment, and the systems that govern the operation. Each contributed independently to safety, but in combination, they created conditions where error could propagate unnoticed. Aircraft. The aircraft assigned to Flight 732 was a narrow-body, twin-engine airliner, representative of early 1980s commercial technology. Its A-frame and propulsion systems were reliable, maintained to contemporary standards, and free of critical defects prior to the flight. Routine inspections verified structural integrity, engine performance, and control surface functionality. Navigation equipment reflected a transitional era. The aircraft featured conventional VOI and NDB receivers, an autopilot capable of maintaining altitude and heading, and an early-generation ground proximity warning system, GPWS. This GPWS could issue cautionary alerts if the aircraft approached terrain at excessive rates of descent, but it lacked predictive capabilities that later systems would offer. In practice, this meant that a crew could descend toward rising terrain in low visibility without receiving early warning, only seconds before the margin of safety closed. Autopilot engagement and mode selection required careful monitoring. The system could maintain a steady descent profile, but minor misconfigurations or mode misinterpretation could allow the aircraft to deviate subtly from the intended approach. The narrow body's performance characteristics demanded precise airspeed control, particularly during the late stages of descent when maneuvering options were constrained by both terrain and weather. Crew. The crew consisted of an experienced captain with thousands of flight hours and a first officer who, though less seasoned, had accumulated adequate experience on the aircraft type. Both had undergone CRM training, emphasizing cross-checking, open communication, and monitoring each other for deviation from expected parameters. Fatigue considerations were significant. The flight occurred during early morning hours, a circadian low point for alertness. While neither crew member was legally fatigued, human performance studies indicate that even minor reductions in alertness can affect decision-making, particularly when workload is high or when visual cues are limited. Crew coordination during descent is critical. Pilots monitor instruments, reference approach charts, communicate with ATC, and anticipate terrain. Distractions, subtle misalignments in expectation, or task saturation can reduce the speed and accuracy of these processes. In Flight 732, the interaction between crew monitoring and instrument interpretation would prove pivotal. Environment. The approach corridor south of Sydney presented a combination of natural and atmospheric challenges. The terrain rises sharply in ridges and isolated hills beyond the coastal plain, creating zones where minimum safe altitudes climb rapidly over short distances. Nighttime conditions amplified the difficulty. Cloud cover removed visual terrain references, darkness masked subtle elevations, and scattered urban lighting offered no consistent cues. Meteorological data from the night showed stratified clouds, low ceilings, and intermittent visibility, all within operational limits but sufficient to obscure visual confirmation of terrain. Coastal fog pockets and slight wind shear could subtly influence aircraft trajectory. In combination, these conditions reduce a natural redundancy provided by visual situational awareness. The ocean horizon can be misleading at night. Pilots descending over water with low cloud often misjudge altitude relative to terrain when only instruments are available. Without a clearly defined visual horizon, depth perception relies entirely on reliable instrument interpretation, which becomes more demanding under workload and circadian stress. Systems. Air traffic control and organizational systems added another layer of complexity. Controllers were responsible for sequencing multiple arrivals into Sydney, providing vectors, and maintaining safe separation. Procedures mandated altitude restrictions at key fixes, readbacks of instructions, and monitoring of aircraft position relative to terrain. Approach charts detailed step-down fixes, minimum altitudes, and recommended procedures. Compliance required accurate cross-referencing of navigation aids and altimeter settings. At the time, systems were designed with redundancy. Errors at one stage could often be caught by checks at another. However, redundancy depends on all layers functioning as expected. When minor deviations occur across multiple layers simultaneously, the protective effect diminishes. Within the airline, standard operating procedures emphasize adherence to published approaches and communication protocols. Crew briefings included expected altitudes, navigation fixes, and contingency planning. Yet systemic factors, such as workload management, scheduling pressures, and transitional reliance on evolving technology, could subtly reduce the effectiveness of these safeguards. Synthesis. Each element, aircraft, crew, environment, systems, was functioning within nominal parameters. The aircraft was mechanically sound, the crew trained, whether within operational limits, and procedures followed. Yet the convergence of small deviations, obscured terrain, early morning circadian low, and procedural complexity created a fragile equilibrium. Accidents of this type rarely stem from a single point of failure. They emerge from an alignment of factors, each tolerable in isolation, but dangerous in combination. For Flight 732, that alignment was quietly forming during the descent south of Sydney, unnoticed, unremarkable, routine, until the final moments when the margin of safety vanished. The final descent of Flight 732 unfolded with a deceptive calm of routine operations. Instruments glowed softly in the cockpit, autopilot engaged, and crew actions followed the standard sequence. Checklist completed, navigation cross-checked, altimeters verified. Outside, cloud layers obscured the rising terrain. The world below was invisible, featureless, yet unforgiving. The aircraft had crossed the initial fixes on the published approach. Controllers provided vectors to maintain separation from other arrivals. Speed and altitude appeared consistent with procedure. To any observer at a distance, nothing suggested imminent danger. The sequence of actions was correct, yet the margin for error had narrowed. As the aircraft descended below the first cloud layer, subtle misalignments began to accumulate. Minor deviations in altitude, influenced by workload and circadian factors, were not immediately apparent. Cross-checks between captain and first officer occurred, but the procedural rhythm created the assumption that the aircraft remained within the safe corridor. The terrain beneath the aircraft rose more quickly than anticipated. Hills and ridges, invisible in darkness and obscured by clouds, presented obstacles that could only be avoided through precise adherence to minimum altitudes. In these final moments, the aircraft was in a zone where visual cues offered no warning, and predictive GPWS capabilities were absent. By design, the system could not anticipate terrain beyond its programmed envelope. Approach chart specified a series of step-down altitudes. At the last fix, the aircraft was expected to stabilize at a defined minimum altitude before turning toward the runway. The crew executed the approach nominally, but small timing discrepancies, minor misreadings, and the inherent difficulty of night operations over rising terrain combined to reduce the margin for error to near zero. Controllers monitored the flight. Calls were made, altitudes confirmed. Everything appeared routine until a subtle irregularity on radar suggested the aircraft had descended lower than intended. The deviation was small, perhaps imperceptible to those accustomed to normal variance in approach profiles. There was no dramatic mechanical failure. There was no sudden weather event. The system that had carried the aircraft safely for hundreds of miles had simply reached the limit of its safety margin. The final seconds were a testament to the unforgiving nature of terrain. Flight 732 intersected the rising ground beyond the coastal plain. The aircraft's forward momentum, standard approach speed, and proximity to terrain left no time for corrective action. The event was instantaneous from the perspective of those below, a moment when physics, environment, and human factors converged. Emergency services would later describe the scene as remote and difficult to access. Investigators reconstructed the descent using flight recorders, radar data, and witness accounts. They confirmed that the accident was not caused by a single catastrophic event, but by a chain of small deviations, misjudgments, and limitations in equipment, all operating within an environment where terrain and darkness offered no margin for correction. From a procedural standpoint, the accident was a controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. The aircraft was fully functional, fully controllable, and under the command of a competent crew. Yet in the absence of early warning, within the constraints of night, cloud, and rising terrain, the outcome was irreversible. The airspace returned to routine operations within minutes. Controllers sequenced remaining arrivals. Radar blips continued their slow, predictable descent toward the runway. Flight 732's final trajectory was already etched into history, a somber example of how ordinary operations can converge into tragedy when multiple risk factors align. The accident would prompt a comprehensive examination of procedures, training, technology, and organizational culture. Every element, aircraft design, crew resource management, environmental awareness, and procedural compliance, will be scrutinized for its role in this convergence. The lessons, though learned after loss, would reshape safety standards for decades. The aftermath of Flight 732 was defined not by spectacle, but by meticulous reconstruction. Emergency services arrive at the remote approach terrain south of Sydney, contending with steep ridges, low cloud, and limited access roads. Rescue crews describe the environment as unforgiving, requiring coordinated ground teams and specialized equipment to reach the site. In those first hours, the focus was on confirming the status of the flight, accounting for passengers and crew, and securing the area for investigation. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, ATSB, led the formal inquiry. Investigators recovered the Flight Data Recorder, FDR, and Cockpit Voice Recorder, CVR, critical instruments in reconstructing the sequence of events. Analysis revealed that all aircraft systems had been operating normally, and that no mechanical failure contributed to the accident. Engines, flight controls, and navigation instruments functioned within expected tolerances. The aircraft had been fully controllable up to the point of impact. Examination of the cockpit voice recorder provided insight into crew actions. The crew adhered to checklists and procedures, communicated effectively, and responded as trained. The FDR demonstrated that the descent profile followed the published approach nominally until the final moments, when minor deviations in altitude and timing compounded over several seconds. The absence of predictive terrain awareness technology meant the crew had no warning of the rising ground ahead. Meteorological data confirmed low cloud and limited visibility during the approach. Investigators noted that night operations over such terrain inherently reduce situational awareness. The combination of circadian low-point fatigue, task saturation during approach, and subtle environmental illusions had contributed to the crew's inability to recognize the proximity of terrain until it was too late. ATSB findings classified the accident as a controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. The report highlighted the interplay of human, environmental, and procedural factors. It emphasized that while each element was independently within acceptable limits, their convergence created conditions beyond the margin of safety. The inquiry concluded that the accident was preventable with enhanced terrain awareness, more rigorous monitoring during critical phases of flight, and procedural enhancements for approaches into complex terrain under low visibility conditions. The impact on the aviation community was immediate and practical. Airlines reassessed approach procedures for night operations over elevated terrain. Regulators accelerated the adoption of enhanced ground proximity warning systems, EGPWS, capable of predictive alerts based on terrain databases. Crew training programs were updated to emphasize situational awareness under night and low visibility conditions, including cross-verification techniques and stricter altitude monitoring protocols. Public reaction was measured but somber. Media coverage focused on the technical and procedural aspects of the accident rather than speculation or dramatization. The professional tone reflected both the investigative process and respect for those lost. Families received detailed briefings on the investigative findings, highlighting that the accident was not caused by negligence but by a chain of ordinary factors converging under challenging conditions. Organizationally, Australian National Airways implemented immediate reviews of flight planning, approach briefings, and operational oversight. Other carriers in the region examined their procedures in light of the findings, ensuring that similar approach routes incorporated maximum safeguards. The aftermath extended beyond regulatory compliance. It catalyzed a cultural shift in approach to safety during critical phases of flight. Nighttime, low visibility operations over rising terrain were no longer considered routine. They were understood as high-risk phases requiring additional vigilance, technological support, and procedural rigor. Flight 732's legacy became a benchmark in CFIT prevention. The accident underscored that aviation safety depends not only on mechanical reliability but on the alignment of human performance, environmental conditions, and system design. Its lessons reverberated through training manuals, simulator scenarios, regulatory frameworks, and technological developments, ensuring that the loss, while tragic, contributed to preventing future occurrences. The reconstruction of events highlighted that accidents are rarely singular events. They are the culmination of multiple, interacting factors that, in isolation, appear innocuous. Flight 732's aftermath exemplified how systematic investigation transforms tragedy into actionable knowledge, shaping aviation safety for generations. Flight 732 left an indelible mark on Australian aviation, not through spectacle, but through the quiet evolution of safety. Its lessons were embedded in procedure, technology, and training, transforming the approach to night operations over challenging terrain. The most immediate legacy was technological. In the years following the accident, airlines accelerated adoption of enhanced ground proximity warning systems, EGPWS. Unlike the earlier generation GPWS, these systems incorporated digital terrain databases and predictive alerting, giving crews advance warning of rising ground along their flight path. What once could be encountered with mere seconds' notice could now be anticipated, allowing timely corrective action and dramatically reducing CFIT risk. Procedural reforms accompanied technological upgrades. Published approach charts were revised to emphasize minimum altitudes at step-down fixes, with clearer depiction of terrain hazards. Airlines instituted mandatory cross-verification of altimeter settings and approach profiles, reinforcing CRM principles under high workload conditions. Night and low visibility approaches over rising terrain were recognized as inherently high risk, prompting the development of specialized briefing protocols and scenario-based simulator training. Crews practiced not only standard approaches, but also contingencies for navigational uncertainty and instrument failure. The organizational impact extended to scheduling and fatigue management. Flights occurring during circadian low points, early morning or late night, were scrutinized more closely. Operators adopted strategies to mitigate human performance limitations, including crew pairing, duty rotation adjustments, and reinforced monitoring during critical descent phases. Regulatory oversight evolved in parallel. Aviation authorities incorporated CFIT prevention into their safety audit frameworks, mandating reporting, review, and implementation of predictive terrain awareness technology. The Flight 732 investigation became a reference case in the education of pilots, controllers, and safety managers, demonstrating that accidents often emerge not from dramatic failures but from cumulative minor deviations. Reflecting on the accident, the most profound lesson is systemic. Safety in aviation is not guaranteed by a single measure. It is created through redundancy, vigilance, communication, and the integration of human, technological, and environmental awareness. Flight 732 illustrates that ordinary procedures, under routine conditions, can yield extraordinary consequences if the alignment of factors erodes margins imperceptibly. Today, flights into complex terrain under night or low visibility conditions benefit from those lessons. Enhanced alerts, rigorous training, improved procedural clarity, and an ingrained safety culture collectively reduce risk. Each modern descent carries a legacy of Flight 732, a quiet reminder that vigilance, preparation, and technology must work in unison to maintain safety. The narrative closes not with drama, but with reflection. The loss remains a solemn reminder of the vulnerability inherent in flight. Yet, from this vulnerability arose improvements that continue to protect lives. Flight 732, while tragic, became a catalyst for progress, demonstrating that the quiet application of lessons learned is the most enduring tribute to those lost. In the end, the sky over Sydney remains the same, but those who navigate it carry forward knowledge that ensures the ordinary flight remains extraordinary in its safety.